At 54, 3 days after she signed the papers that ended a 26-year marriage, Loretta Vance sat in the parking lot of a Waffle House on Highway 61 with $340 in her checking account, a cardboard box of her own belongings in the back seat, and a letter she'd found folded inside the lining of an old coat her mother had left her, a coat she'd never once worn, and nearly dropped at Goodwill that morning before something made her stop and feel the hem. The letter was addressed to no one. It was written in her mother's handwriting on a single sheet of notebook paper, and it mentioned a property Loretta had never heard of, a storage unit on Reedham Road, paid through the end of the year, with a combination she'd have to find herself. Her mother had died 8 months ago. She had not told Loretta this place existed. What was inside it would take apart the story. Loretta had been telling herself about her own life. And once she found it, she could not go back to the woman she'd been in that parking lot, small and finished, and sure that everything worth knowing was already behind her. Before we get into what Loretta found, take a moment and subscribe to Giant Stories if you haven't already. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel now. Let us tell you about Loretta. Loretta Vance. She'd kept the name because she'd had it longer than she'd had anything else. Had grown up the only daughter of a woman named June Mobley in a town called Harlan's Creek, Tennessee. A place so small the gas station doubled as the post office, and everybody's business was everybody's business except, it turned out, her mother's. June Mobley had been a quiet woman, not cold. People remembered her warmly always. She'd worked the front desk at the county health clinic for 31 years, made pound cake for every funeral in 3 zip codes, and kept a garden so orderly it looked embarrassed by itself. But she didn't talk about money. She didn't talk about the past. And she had never, not once in Loretta's memory, talked about her own mother. Loretta's grandmother, a woman named Cora, who had died before Loretta was born and existed in the family mostly as an absence, a name spoken carefully and then set back down. Loretta had stopped asking about Cora sometime in her teens. You learned which doors your mother kept shut. She'd married Dennis Vance at 28, moved 40 minutes north to Clarksville, had 2 kids, a son named Marcus who lived in Denver now, and called on birthdays, and a daughter named Shelby who was 22 and waitressing and trying, and called more often than that. The marriage had been for a long time, not bad. Dennis sold insurance. He coached Little League 1 season and quit. He mowed the lawn and forgot to clean the gutters, and left his coffee cup on the counter directly above the dishwasher for 26 years. And Loretta had washed it so many times without saying anything, that by the end she couldn't remember if she'd ever decided not to say anything. Or just never found the right moment, and the years covered it over. There was no affair. There was no single rupture. There was just a long, slow leak that neither of them patched, and one November morning when the kids were both gone, and the house was quiet in that particular way that houses get, when there's no longer a reason for 2 people to keep filling the silence. Dennis sat down at the kitchen table and said he thought they both knew, and Loretta said yes, and they were both right and also both wrong. And the lawyers handled the rest. She got the car, he got the house. She got the cardboard box and the coat her mother had left her. She had almost thrown the coat away. It was a heavy wool thing, slate gray, the kind of coat built to last, and therefore deeply unfashionable by the time June died, and it had been hanging in June's closet for so long the shoulders had taken the shape of the hanger. Loretta had put it in the Goodwill pile 3 times in the months after the funeral. Each time she'd moved it back. She couldn't have told you why. The morning she signed the divorce papers, she drove to her storage unit, the one holding what remained of her half of a 26-year marriage, and she put the box in. She picked up the coat to fold it, and felt the hem, the way you do when you're folding something that isn't folding right, and there was something stiff inside the lining. She pulled the stitching at the seam. The letter slid out onto her palm. June's handwriting, small and careful, pressed hard like every word cost her something. Loretta, if you found this, I've already gone, and I am sorry I didn't say this while I could sit across from you and watch your face. There is a storage unit on Reedham Road in Harlan's Creek, Unit 14. The combination is the year your grandmother Cora was born. You'll have to find that yourself. I think you should. What's inside belongs to you and has for a long time. I should have shown you sooner. The coat was your grandmother's. I kept meaning to tell you, Mama. That was all. Loretta sat in her car in the storage facility parking lot with the letter in her hand and the coat across her lap, and $340 in her account, and a life that felt like a house after the furniture's been taken out. Structurally fine, utterly empty, and for the first time since November, she felt something other than numb. She felt the floor move. The funeral had been 8 months before the divorce, which meant Loretta had lost both things she'd built her adult life around inside of a single calendar year. She didn't have words for what that did to a person. She just knew that she'd been moving through the months in a kind of managed fog, doing what needed doing, signing what needed signing, emptying what needed emptying, and somewhere in that process she had mislaid herself so completely. She wasn't sure there was a self left to find. She was 54 years old. She had $340 and a coat that had belonged to a grandmother she'd never known. She was going to drive to Harlan's Creek and find out what year Cora Mobley was born. The county library was a 20-minute drive, and the woman at the genealogy desk was named Patrice, and she had the quiet, efficient energy of someone who had spent decades helping people find the things they were afraid to find. Loretta explained briefly, just the name, just what she needed, and Patrice typed for 40 seconds and turned the monitor, and there it was. Cora June Mobley, née Halstead, born 1931, died 1969. Loretta drove to Reedham Road with that number in her head. The unit was in a low concrete building at the edge of town, the kind of place with good locks and no windows and a vending machine in the office that sold only off-brand drinks. Unit 14. She turned the combination. 1931. The lock opened. She pulled up the door. It was not what she expected, which was clutter. It was organized. Carefully, almost formally organized, the way someone arranges a room they expect someone else to eventually enter. There were plastic bins, labeled in June's handwriting. There was a wooden trunk against the back wall, the old kind with brass fittings, the kind of thing you'd call an heirloom if you knew its history, and a yard sale find if you didn't. There was a folding chair set open in the center of the unit facing the trunk, as if June had known Loretta would need somewhere to sit. Loretta sat. She started with the bins because they were labeled, and labels felt like something to hold on to. The first said Cora's papers, the second said photographs, the third said legal. The fourth, in smaller writing, said read this one last. She did not read it last. She is the first to admit that. Inside the fourth bin was a composition notebook, blue cover, soft at the corners from years of handling. June's handwriting on the inside cover. This is the part I could never figure out how to say out loud. Loretta set it on her knee and opened it and read her mother for the first time. If you found yourself holding your breath for Loretta, you're not alone. And before we go any further, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. 'Cause what was in that notebook is the part we've been waiting to get to. What June Mobley had spent her whole life not saying out loud was this: Cora Halstead had not simply died young, the way Loretta had always understood it. 38 years old, heart failure, before Loretta was born. A fact delivered in a single sentence whenever Loretta had asked and then closed like a book returned to its shelf. Cora had died in debt. Serious debt. The kind that in 1969 in a small Tennessee county meant losing things, and Cora had lost things. This house, the land, a small piece of river property that had been in the Halstead family since before anyone living could remember. She'd borrowed against it to keep a business running, a laundry she'd started on her own in 1961, one of the first black-owned businesses on that street. And when she died suddenly, the debt came due all at once, and the property was taken by the bank and resold. And June, who was 17 years old and suddenly alone, had spent the next 5 decades believing that was the end of it. Except June had been wrong. Because in the notebook, in careful handwriting that got smaller and more precise as June got older, and the story got harder to hold, June had written what she'd discovered 12 years before she died, that the land had not been sold clean, that there had been an irregularity in the 1969 transaction, that a lawyer in Nashville named Terrence Webb had written to June in 2008, a letter June had nearly thrown away because she didn't understand it, and then had carried around in her coat pocket for 3 weeks, before she finally drove to the library and asked the reference librarian to help her read the legal language. And what that letter said, once she understood it, was that the resale of the property had included a parcel that was not properly included in Cora's debt, a parcel that had belonged not to Cora personally, but to a family trust, and that Cora's heir, June, might have a claim. Might. June had not known what to do with might. She was 63 years old. She was not a woman who sued people or hired lawyers or made claims. She was a woman who made pound cake, and kept a garden and went quiet when things got hard because going quiet was the thing that had gotten her through 17 with nothing, and 30 and 40 and all the years after. She had put the lawyer's letter in the notebook, and she had put the notebook in the bin, and she had kept paying the storage unit bill every year, and she had told herself she would figure out what to do with it, and she had not figured out what to do with it, and then she had died with it undone, and left it in the lining of a coat for her daughter to find. At the bottom of the notebook on the last page June had written on, in handwriting shakier than the rest, "I was too afraid to start the fight. You are braver than me, Loretta. I always knew it even when you didn't. The lawyer's number is in the legal bin. Call him. You deserve what Cora built." Loretta sat in the folding chair with the notebook in her lap and the coat across her shoulders. She'd put it on without thinking, because the unit was cold, and she stayed there for a long time. Outside, a truck rumbled past on Reedham Road, and the fluorescent light at the back of the unit buzzed, and the trunk sat there with its brass fittings, and the bins sat there with their labels, and the whole assembled weight of two women's silence pressed down on her at once. She had spent 26 years going quiet when things got hard. She'd learned it from June, who'd learned it from necessity, who'd passed it on without meaning to the way you pass on the shape of your hands. She was 54 years old. She had $340 in her account. She pulled out her phone and opened the legal bin. The lawyer was still practicing. Terrence Webb was 71, semi-retired, and had not heard from anyone in the Mobley family in 12 years. When Loretta called, there was a long pause on the other end, and then he said very quietly, "I kept the file," as if he'd been waiting, as if he'd known someone would eventually call. He drove up from Nashville 2 days later. He was a tall, deliberate man who moved like someone accustomed to being underestimated, and he sat at the kitchen table in the house of a friend of Loretta's, because Loretta didn't have a kitchen table of her own yet, and he set the file on the table and opened it, and took her through it piece by piece. The property in question was 12 acres on a bend of the Cumberland River, 4 miles outside Harlan's Creek. In 1969, Cora Halstead's estate had been administered under duress, quickly and badly, by a court-appointed administrator who had lumped the parcel into the general estate without verifying the trust documentation. The parcel, under a family trust instrument signed by Cora's father in 1948, had been held in trust for Cora's heirs, not Cora personally, which meant it had never, legally, been Cora's to borrow against, which meant the bank's claim on it and the subsequent sale was built on a foundation that didn't hold. "This is not a simple case," Terrence said. "The property has changed hands twice since 1969. There are people living on part of it. There will be resistance. I want to be honest with you about that." "How long have you been sitting on this file?" Loretta asked. 12 years, he said. "Your mother was afraid." "I know," Loretta said. "What about you?" He looked at her for a moment. "I kept the file," he said again, and this time she understood it was the closest he was going to come to, saying he'd been waiting for someone to give him the go-ahead, waiting for the heir who would fight. "Start wherever you need to start," she said. She should tell you she said this with confidence. She said it with her hands flat on the table so they wouldn't shake, and her voice steadier than she felt, and a silence in her chest where something solid should have been. She was bluffing the bravery and hoping it would grow into the real thing. It did, but not immediately. The weeks that followed were not triumphant weeks. Terrence filed preliminary paperwork and came back to her with numbers. His fees were reduced but not nothing. Court costs were not nothing. The research required to reconstruct the 1948 trust instrument was not nothing. And Loretta sat with those numbers and looked at her bank account and felt the old habit rise up the way it always had. Go quiet. Don't make the fight. Slide it to the back of the drawer and tell yourself not yet. She almost said not yet. She almost said, let me think about it and not thought about it and let it turn into never. She knows that now. She sat with the almost for a long time. What changed it was the trunk. She hadn't opened the trunk yet. She'd been afraid of it. The way you're afraid of the last thing because once you've opened it there's nothing left to find. She went back to the unit on a Tuesday morning and she opened it. Inside was a business. Not the remnants of one. The actual working records of Cora's laundry. The handwritten ledgers. The customer logs. The receipts. The small cardboard tickets that had gone with each order. The notebook where Cora had tracked her accounts receivable in columns, so neat they looked typeset. And at the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth tied with twine, was a photograph, a woman in her mid-30s standing in front of a storefront. A sign above the door read Halstead Laundry, Est, 1961. She was looking directly at the camera, not smiling exactly but not smiling, with the expression of someone who knows exactly what they've built and is waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. On the back of the photograph, in a handwriting Loretta didn't recognize, Cora, opening day. She pressed every shirt in that window herself the night before. Loretta sat on the floor of the storage unit with that photograph in her hands and the oilcloth in her lap, and she looked at this woman she'd never known, who had started a business alone in 1961 in a Tennessee county that did not want her to, who had pressed every shirt in the window the night before opening day, who had lost everything at 38 and left behind a 17-year-old daughter and a trunk full of careful records and a piece of land that had never legally been taken. She called Terrence that afternoon and told him to move forward. She is going to need you to understand how hard that phone call was. She had $340. She was sleeping in her friend Patrice's spare room, different Patrice than the library. This Patrice had been her college roommate and did not ask questions and kept good coffee and said only you can stay as long as you need. She had no income yet, had been out of the formal workforce for 11 years managing the house, and then managing June's illness, and then managing the divorce. And the job market at 54 looked at her the way it looked at all of them, which is to say it looked past her. She started working at the laundry at the edge of Harlan's Creek, not Cora's, long gone but a new one, commercial, industrial machines, because she needed money and because it felt, in a way she didn't examine too carefully, like it was the right place to be. The owner was a man named Garland Bosch, 60, widowed, who ran the place with his grown son and did not talk much, and reminded her in certain ways of people she'd known all her life, the kind of quiet competence that doesn't announce itself. He showed her the machines once and she learned them, and on Fridays he paid her in cash because she'd asked him to. And he hadn't made it a thing. She told him one afternoon, folding sheets, what Terrence was doing. She didn't plan to. It came out in the way things do when you've been carrying them alone long enough. Garland listened without interrupting, which she noticed, and when she finished he said only, "Your grandmother built something. That means something around here." And then he went back to the sorting. She thought about that for a week. The legal process moved the way legal processes move, which is slowly and then suddenly. Terrence located the 1948 trust instrument in a county archive in Nashville. Original, signed, notarized, unambiguous. He filed in circuit court. The current owner of the contested parcel, a man named Frank Oswald, who had purchased it in 1987 as part of a larger land deal, and who had, by all accounts, no knowledge that the original 1969 sale had been improper, received the filing and retained his own attorney. The newspaper in the next county over ran a brief item about the lawsuit and got the facts approximately half right, which was more right than usual. And then something happened that Terrence had not predicted and Loretta had not expected. People started coming to the laundry. Not to do laundry, to talk to Loretta. An older woman named Evelyn who had brought her husband's shirts to Cora's laundry every week for years before it closed, who had been 16 when Cora died, and who cried when she described the line of people standing outside the shop that morning the sign came down. A retired school teacher named Charles, who had grown up 2 streets from the laundry, and remembered Cora specifically because Cora had, without fanfare or announcement, pressed the graduation gown of every child in the neighborhood who couldn't afford the dry cleaning fee. Just quietly done it. Never charged, never told anyone, never accepted thanks. The families had known, nobody else had. An elderly man named Beaumont Riles, 83, who walked with a cane and had driven 40 minutes to find her, who sat down in the plastic chair by the door and told her that Cora Halstead had once lent his mother money, actual money, out of the register, in 1965, when his mother was 3 days from losing the house, and said only pay it back when you can, and if you can't, don't worry about it. His mother had paid it back. Every cent, over 4 years. Beaumont had a letter, the only letter Cora had ever apparently written, acknowledging receipt of the last payment. He had kept it for 58 years. He put it on the counter in front of Loretta and said, "I was hoping someone from that family would turn up eventually. I didn't know who to give this to." Loretta held that letter and thought about a woman she had never met, who had pressed graduation gowns in secret and lent money out of a register in 1965, and kept records so careful. They looked typeset and been taken at 38, and left a 17-year-old daughter, with nothing but a trunk and a coat and a piece. of land nobody came to claim for 50 years. She thought about what June had written. I was too afraid to start the fight. She understood it now in a way she hadn't when she first read it. Fear wasn't cowardice. It was the weight of knowing the stakes and not yet having the ground under you to hold the weight. June had been 17 with nothing. June had spent 50 years building enough ground to stand on, and then run out of time before she could stand on it, and left it for Loretta instead. The trial date was set for the following spring, but first, there was a planning commission hearing, because the company that owned the access road to the contested parcel, a development firm out of Memphis that had been quietly assembling river property for a proposed resort, had filed for an expedited easement that would pass directly across the 12 acres before the lawsuit was resolved. The easement filing was legal. The timing was, Terrence said with a careful flatness, not a coincidence, he said. If they get the easement first, the land's value changes. The settlement calculus changes. I think that's what they're after, he said. I need to go to that hearing and make the argument. I'll need you there. She said no, he said, and it would help if people who knew Cora came and said what they knew. Loretta stood in the laundry that evening after Garland had locked up, and asked Evelyn and Charles and Beaumont and 4 others who had found their way to her in the weeks before if they would come to a public meeting and say out loud what they'd told her privately. Say it in front of the county. Say it about a woman none of them had been asked to speak about in 50 years. There was a silence. Beaumont Riles, 83 years old, said, I drove 40 minutes to give you that letter. You think I won't drive 40 minutes to say it out loud? One by one, the others said yes. The night before the hearing, Loretta drove to the storage unit. She sat in the folding chair her mother had left open for her, and she held the photograph of Cora standing in front of the shop, and she thought about what it cost a woman to start something in 1961 in this county, and what it cost to keep it running alone, and what it cost June to bury all of it for 50 years out of fear, and what it would cost Loretta to stand up tomorrow in a fluorescent-lit room full of strangers and say this land was not taken fairly, and I intend to get it back. She was afraid. She sat with the fear the same way she'd been sitting with everything this year. Not solving it, not suppressing it, just staying in the room with it until it became familiar enough to stop running her. She drove home in the dark. She was still afraid. She had decided that the fear didn't get to vote. The planning commission met in the basement of the county building in a room with water-stained ceiling tiles and chairs that squeaked when you moved. The development firm had sent a lawyer from Memphis in a good suit who talked about jobs and tax revenue and the economic future of a county that had been losing population for 20 years. He had renderings on a standing board, a resort with a dock and a restaurant and a pier over the river. He called the 12 acres a vacant riverside parcel with no current productive use, and he said the easement was a routine infrastructure matter. He was polished and he was fast, and when he sat down 3 of the 5 commissioners were nodding. The chairman asked if anyone wished to speak in opposition. Beaumont Riles stood up. He was slow getting to the podium. He used his cane. The room was quiet in the particular way a room gets when an old man is taking his time, which is a different quiet than impatience. It was the quiet of people who have been raised to wait, he said. My name is Beaumont Riles. I'm 83 years old and I've lived in this county my whole life. I'm here to tell you about a woman named Cora Halstead, because I don't believe you can vote on this land without knowing who built something on it first. He said, in 1965 my family was 3 days from losing the house. Cora Halstead reached into her register and lent my mother money and said, don't worry about paying it back if you can't. She ran a business on that street for 8 years and she pressed graduation gowns for every kid in the neighborhood who couldn't pay the fee. And she never told a soul and never took credit. I kept a letter she wrote for 58 years because I didn't have anywhere to give it to, and I didn't think it should be lost. He put his hand flat on the podium. The woman who built on this land was taken at 38, and her estate was handled so badly, her daughter lost a piece of land that was never legally part of the debt. There's a lawsuit in circuit court that will tell you the legal part. I'm telling you the other part. This isn't a vacant parcel. It's where something was built by somebody who deserved better than what she got, and her granddaughter is standing here 55 years later, trying to get it back, and I think the least this county can do is not run a road through it while she's doing it. He sat down. Evelyn went next. Then Charles. Then the 4 others. Each of them said something different, and each of them said the same thing. They had known a woman. and the woman had mattered, and the land had been part of something, and the something had not stopped mattering just because 50 years had passed. Then Loretta stood up. She had not written anything down. She had thought about writing something down and decided against it, because she was afraid she would read it instead of say it, and she had spent enough years reading from a page she'd written in advance, rather than saying the thing she actually meant. She said, "My name is Loretta Vance. Cora Halstead was my grandmother. I never met her. I found out 8 months ago that she had built something on this land, and I found out at the same time that it had been taken improperly. And I found out the way I found out most things this year, which is late, from a document sitting in a storage unit on a folding chair my mother had left open for me." She stopped. She let that sit. "My mother was afraid to start this fight. I understand why she was afraid. I've been afraid every single day since I started it. But there is a trust instrument in the Nashville archive from 1948 that says this land belongs to Cora's heirs, and a circuit court filing that says the 1969 sale shouldn't have included it, and a letter an 83-year-old man kept for 58 years, because he thought it should be remembered." She looked at the development lawyer, and then she looked at the commissioners, and she did not look away. "You can grant this easement. You can do that. But I would ask you to decide whether you want this county's name on a document that cleared the way for a resort over land that's already in active litigation. Land that was taken from a black woman in 1969 who built a business and helped her neighbors and didn't have anyone to fight for her. My grandmother didn't have anyone to fight for her. She does now." She picked up the photograph of Cora standing in front of the shop, opening day. Every shirt in the window pressed herself the night before, and she held it up so the room could see it, and she set it back down. "Thank you." The Planning Commission voted 3-2 to table the easement petition, pending resolution of the circuit court case. The development firm's lawyer packed up his renderings without looking at anyone and left. Garland Bosch, who had come without telling Loretta he was coming and sat in the back row without a word, shook her hand on the way out and said only, "Your grandmother would have liked you." The circuit court case took another 14 months. Loretta will not tell you it was easy, because it was not easy. There were depositions and countersuits and a settlement offer from Frank Oswald's attorney that was structured to look generous and was not, and Terrence walked her through it and said, "Your call." And she said no, and they kept going. There were months when the laundry money barely covered the room she'd finally rented on Birch Street, and months when she was certain she had made a catastrophic mistake. And a few nights when she called Shelby long after midnight and didn't explain why. And Shelby, who was 22 and figuring out her own life, said, "I'm here, Mom," and that was enough. What she found in those 14 months was the thing she hadn't expected to find, herself. Not in a neat way, not in a way that wrapped up clean, but piece by piece, in the way Terrence explained a legal argument and she understood it, in the way she learned to operate every machine in Garland's laundry and could close the shop alone by month 4. In the way she drove back to the storage unit on a Saturday and opened the trunk and spent a whole day going through Cora's ledgers and began to understand that the woman in the photograph had not only built a business but built it well. The records were beautiful, meticulous. The accounts receivable tracked to the penny, the customer logs going back to the first week, a woman who knew the value of what she was building and treated it accordingly. Loretta had thought Cora was gone. Cora was all over those ledgers. Cora was in every column and every careful entry, present tense, talking to anyone who looked. The circuit court ruled in Loretta's favor on a Tuesday in March, 17 months after Terrence had filed. The 1969 transaction was voided as to the contested parcel. The title reverted. Frank Oswald's attorney had quietly shifted positions 3 months before the ruling, and Loretta bore him no particular ill will. He'd been a buyer in good faith from a seller who'd had a cloudy title, and he'd simply been downstream of something that wasn't his fault. The development firm withdrew its easement application 4 days after the ruling without comment. Loretta stood on the 12 acres for the first time, on a Friday morning in April, a cool day, with the river running high from the spring melt, and the cedar coming down to the bank on the south side and the smell of it sharp and clean through the truck window. She parked at the top of the slope and walked down to the water, and stood there in the mud at the river's edge, and looked at what Cora had held in trust for heirs who would need 55 years to arrive. She didn't know yet what she would do with it. She had thoughts. She had a conversation coming with Terrence about development options that did not include a resort. She had a long call planned with Marcus in Denver, who had followed the case from a distance and said finally, the week before the ruling, "Mom, I didn't know you had this in you," which was the most he'd said in one sentence in longer than she could remember, and which she had received quietly, without telling him that she hadn't known either. She had a question she'd been sitting with for months, put there by Beaumont Riles the day he handed her the letter. I didn't know who to give this to. She had been thinking about that, about all the things in this county that no one knew who to give to, that sat in trunks and coat linings and storage units, because the people who should have received them had been afraid or lost or buried without the right door opening, about what her mother had been trying to say and had never found the front door to say it through, about what Cora had built in 1961 that had been gone for 50 years and was still, in every essential way, here. She had been thinking about what to do with 12 acres on a bend of the Cumberland River that belonged, legally and morally, to a woman's heirs. The thought she kept coming back to, the one she'd fallen asleep on the night of the ruling and woken up with still in her head, was that Cora had run a business that had quietly served her community and quietly absorbed costs other businesses passed on, and never made a production of it. It had been an ordinary business that was also underneath something else, a place where people came with ordinary things and left feeling, somehow, less alone. Loretta thought about that. In September, she filed for a small business license. The name she put on the application was Halstead & Vance, because the business she was building was not hers alone, had never been hers alone, had started in 1961 with a woman who pressed shirts in a window the night before opening day, and Loretta was simply the next one to open the door. She sold the photograph to no one. She hung it inside. That fall she went back to the storage unit for the last time. She had finally sorted through everything. The bins, the trunk, the records. She packed the last of Cora's ledgers into a proper archival box for the Historical Society, because Charles had connections there, and because Cora Halstead's accounts deserved a proper home. She folded the oilcloth. She broke down the bins. She left the folding chair. She didn't know who might need it next, but her mother had left it open and she would leave it open. And whoever came to sit in it would find the unit empty now. All the stored weight of silence finally unpacked and put to use. The chair was for sitting and thinking and being afraid and deciding anyway. It should be available. She locked the unit for the last time on a November afternoon, almost exactly 1 year after Dennis had sat down at the kitchen table and said he thought they both knew. She walked to her truck and she sat in it for a moment in the Reedham Road quiet, and she thought about a year of documents and depositions, and Patrice's spare room, and the laundry machines and Beaumont's cane on the courthouse floor, and Shelby's voice at midnight, and 12 acres coming back through the slow machinery of a court, and a woman in a photograph she was only now beginning to know. She thought about her mother writing in a notebook she was too afraid to say out loud, and tucking it into a coat for a daughter she trusted to be braver. She thought about the line in that notebook she had read and reread until she had it by heart. "You are braver than me, Loretta. I always knew it even when you didn't." She had not known it either. She knew it now. She drove home in the dark with the heater rattling, and the November trees bare against the sky, and for the first time in longer than she could name, the empty seat beside her did not feel like something lost. It felt like room. Here is what Cora Halstead built, and it was never only the laundry or the land or the 12 acres on the river. She built a way of being in a community, quietly, without credit, without announcement, that outlived her by 55 years and arrived, finally, in the hands of a granddaughter who had found it in the lining of a coat at the lowest point of her life. And what Loretta built from that was not just a legal case, or a small business, or a piece of river property returned to the right family. She built the thing her mother had been trying to build and couldn't, the nerve to start. The willingness to sit in the folding chair and open the last bin. The understanding that the only thing worse than starting late is deciding that late means you've missed it. You haven't missed it. Cora started at 30. June started at 63 and ran out of time. Loretta started at 54 with $340, and a coat that didn't fit her, and a letter from a woman who believed in her before she believed in herself. Start wherever you are. The bin is right there. Open it. If Loretta's story sat with you, leave us a comment and tell us which part stayed with you longest. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, because there are more, there are so many more, Make sure you're subscribed to Giant Stories. We'll see you in the next one.